Welcome everyone as you come into our Zoom group and enter our live broadcast. My name is Sherry Davis and I'm really excited to be here with all of you. As we get ready to start, I'll just give a couple moments for folks to join in with us. Again, my name is Sherry Davis. I'm so excited to kick this program off. My pronouns are they and she, and this is the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom's teach-in, featuring stories of incarceration and the '94 crime bill. I'll give just another couple moments for folks to join us, and then we will officially kick off our program. If you're here with us, take a moment to say hi. You can use the chat feature. Tell us who you are, where you're from. We're really excited to hear from you. So welcome to the space, and we're going to kick off in just 30 seconds. All right, we got California in the house, Chicago. I see a shout out for Florida. So people are rolling through. Welcome again, everyone. My name is Sherry Davis. My pronouns are they and she. I run the Participatory Budgeting Project, but we are here today for the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom's teach-in, featuring stories of incarceration and the '94 crime bill. Before we jump in to what we're doing today, let me make sure that I tell you all who we are and what we're here for. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we are the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom, also known as the People's Coalition. It's a formation of base building and member-led grassroots organizations focused on racial justice policy, advocacy institutions, most of which are Black and queer-led, and really represent a cross-section of communities impacted by systems of criminalization and incarceration. Next slide. And so before we continue to go, I just wanted to, again, shout out some of the members of the People's Coalition Steering Committee. These are the folks who are a part of this group that are really committed to our collective freedom and making sure that our communities can thrive. So shout out to the amazing folks that make up this awesome steering committee that allows us to do this really important work. Next slide. Our goal, the goal of this group really is the People's Coalition is focused on dismantling and replacing racist, harmful, and punitive policies that have fueled the crisis of criminalization and incarceration facing the United States, and really replacing those with policies and budgets that truly invest in communities and decarcerate our country. That's the goal, really, so that we can see our folks and people thrive. Next slide. And speaking of communities thriving, one way that we imagine that happening is to see our communities be able to truly shape public dollars and the resources that they create for our communities. The theory of change being those closest to the pain are going to be closest to the solutions that really serve our communities. And as we get ready to jump into our really exciting agenda, let me just review it for us all one time. So we just got through some introductions, some grounding on who we are. And shortly, we'll get some grounding on what the components of the 1994 crime bill are and ground in that kind of landscape generally. Then we'll have an opportunity to really step into a story circle, hear from folks as part of an amazing panel, really get some more understanding of this crime bill and understand what our opportunities for action are to be able to move forward. And then we'll talk about next steps. So this teach-in is one conversation in a larger series that will certainly move us all into action. So get excited for that. As we move forward, I want to invite all of you to share your story. Next slide. Many of us have been impacted by the '94 crime bill, and that bill itself has been devastatingly widespread and it's had long-lasting impact on our communities. The bill itself funneled billions of dollars to state and local governments to increase the presence of police in our communities and in schools. We've seen new jails built and prisons, and those have been filled through these draconian sentencing laws. And behind these numbers are our people, mothers, brothers, and children who have been devastated by this particular bill. Our stories truly help guide this work to name our experiences, to understand our vision, and to really understand what we're building together. You're invited to lend your words and your stories about how you and your community have been impacted by the '94 crime bill. Please note, though, that we do want you to take care of yourself and only share what feels good and comfortable and safe for you in this forum. In order to share your stories, you can use our @peoples_coalition or the hashtag our safety, our freedom. And we really invite you all to get involved in the conversation and to share your story if that feels good for you. Next slide. And so this is the moment that I'm really excited for, and I want to pause for just a second to introduce all of you to our awesome and amazing graphic note taker, Claudia. And Claudia, can you tell us a little bit about what you're going to do today in terms of note taking?
Thank you, Sherry. My name is Claudia Lopez. I use she, her pronouns. And as Sherry mentioned, I'm the visual note taker, visual storyteller. So the purpose of my role here is to be a deep listener of the themes and ideas and wisdom in the conversations and in the stories that are going to be shared today, in order to translate that into a visual format that can serve as an accessible documentation that can be shared more broadly, so that more people have access to what is being shared here, and also to honor the stories and the wisdom of the people that are going to share with us. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that this visual will be accessible to you and will be sent via email. We would like to encourage you to share in your social media. I know folks in this meeting will be sharing in their social media too. And so use it as a tool to advocate for what you're advocating, using the wisdom of your lived experience. And I won't take any more space. You will be getting this. You won't see me doing it so that I don't take over the space, but you will get it afterwards. So just that point of clarification. Back to you, Sherry.
Claudia, I'm so excited that you're here with us and that everyone is going to have an opportunity to experience the way that you're taking notes and the unique way that you're doing it. Thank you for joining us and for doing that. And so, as we've moved through and kind of reviewed why we're here today in our agenda, I'm really excited to pass it off to Dave Pringle from Policy Link to ground us and move us through our program. Over to you, Dave.
Thanks so much, Sherry. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dave Pringle. I'm a policy and campaign manager at the Center for Popular Democracy, working on the justice team, sharing this space with Policy Link and so many other amazing organizations that have come together to form this coalition to take on what we consider to be one of the most harmful pieces of legislation that's been passed in the last 20 or 30 years that impacts our people. I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking about the 1994 crime bill and some of the key components, what it's done over the years and some of the ways that it's influenced, specifically for this teach-in, incarceration throughout the country. As we all know, the United States incarcerates more people than the next 5 or 6 countries combined. And we're going to talk about some of the ways that the '94 crime bill actually influenced and impacted and exacerbated those numbers. And so, as you can see here, the '94 crime bill was passed in '94 under President Bill Clinton. There are some key components that I think really drove what we've come to call mass incarceration today. Things like 3 strikes rules and mandatory minimum sentences were a key feature of the '94 crime bill. And there were billions of dollars that were funneled to state and local governments in order to incentivize their state legislatures to pass legislation that essentially made it so that on the 3rd offense, essentially there was a sort of, you're out sort of dynamic associated with the crime. And so that basically made it so that people were being sentenced extremely harshly for offenses that otherwise would not have been treated as such. Similarly, we saw something called truth in sentencing skyrocket throughout the country. And essentially, truth in sentencing is it's exactly what it sounds like. If someone is sentenced to a certain amount of time for a particular offense, despite good time served or offers of parole, throughout the country, we saw several state legislatures pass legislation that essentially demanded that folks had to serve 85% of their sentence, regardless of how much time they'd actually served. So you can imagine that that would dramatically increase the amount of people spending so much of their time in prison. There are some other key components of the 94 Crime Bill that we've spoken about in the past on other teach-ins and that we'll continue to talk about, things like the COPS program, which has put $19 billion to expand policing in cities across the country. In addition, $10 billion in subsidies to expand state prisons, things like ending Pell Grants for those who are currently incarcerated. It did also include things like the Violence Against Women Act and the federal assault weapons ban, but as we'll discuss in future teach-ins, there's a lot more to those components of the legislation that you might not initially think. Go ahead and switch to the next slide, please. So as I discussed earlier, we really identified the 1994 Crime Bill as a driver of mass incarceration. You can see here from 1970 to 1994, the rate of imprisonment actually exploded 400%, from 300 to 387 per 100,000 people. From 1994 to 2009, we saw imprisonment continue to rise, doubling. The 94 Crime Bill granted states $12.5 billion to build prisons, as I said, if they passed these so-called truth in sentencing laws, which required folks who were incarcerated to serve, again, at least 85% of their sentences. Between 1995 and 1999, we saw 9 states adopt those truth in sentencing laws for the first time. Another 21 states actually changed their truth in sentencing laws to comply with the crime bill's requirements. And so often what the federal government can do is use what we call the power of the purse and can dramatically influence what state and local governments do with their local policy by either creating massive incentives or punishing local governments by withholding resources if the local government or state government doesn't comply with the federal law. So you can see there by 1999, we saw a total of 42 states actually enact similar laws, sustaining an increase in imprisonment. In addition, as I said earlier, states passed 3 strikes laws, enacted mandatory minimum sentencing, and eliminated parole, removing judicial discretion in sentencing. And then essentially, like I was just saying, they dangled bonus dollars. The crime bill encouraged states with those bonus dollars to remain tough on crime with their approach. And again, as you can see, there are $9.7 billion for states to build and operate prisons, including the incarceration of undocumented immigrants. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So one of the things that we always want to make sure that we remind folks is that even though we're often talking about federal legislation, it has a dramatic impact on state and local governments, as I was describing earlier. And so we just highlighted 2 states in particular here. You can see in Florida, for example, the total population of incarcerated adults in Florida increased from just over 68,000 in 1995 to 86,000 by 2005. 18,000 more individuals being put in cages. The Vera Institute reports the total population of incarcerated individuals in the state of Florida in 2015 was 153,405. Net increase in both of those correctional facilities in the state, as well as a number of people incarcerated by the state, is strongly correlated to the increase in funding that came from the grant programs that were released under the 94 Crime Bill. As I mentioned earlier, Florida built an additional 9 corrections facilities between 1990 and 2005. In 2017, Black people constituted 17% of Florida's residents, yet almost 40% of the people incarcerated and 47% of the people in prison in Florida were from the African American community. You can see, as looking at another state in California, after the 1994 Crime Bill was passed, the prison population continued to climb, peaking in 2006 at 173,000 people, began to slowly decline to 127,000 in 2018, and as of now, the total in custody prisoners is 101,000. So you can see that over the years as the 94 Crime Bill was passed, there's this explosion in incarceration, and only until other states started to decarcerate their populations have you seen any kind of decrease. As of 2018, California's incarceration rate remains high at 581 per 100,000 people. And this is a higher rate than all but 2 countries besides the United States as a whole. So just as an overall sort of takeaway from this, we'd like folks to recognize the dramatic impact that the 1994 crime bill had in so many different areas of the criminal legal system, but in particular, the incentives that it created for state and local governments to hold people in cages and to make it that much harder for folks to get their lives back on track. With that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Erica, who's going to be moderating our panel for the rest of the evening.
Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you so much for that, just breaking down the components of the 94 crime bill and also providing some data on the impact of the crime bill and really like putting numbers to it as well. So we know that billions of dollars went to our states and our communities to incarcerate us, our loved ones, community members, and to increase policing in our communities. And so, you know, this feels extremely powerful and a necessary conversation for us to have as we find ourselves in a moment where we are saying defund police, defund cages. Let's actually invest in what keeps us safe. And so much of the campaign is surrounded around really surfacing the stories and acknowledging the harm that the 94 crime bill has done to our community, to loved ones, to people we care about. And so I'm really grateful and honored to be able to have this conversation with advocates, organizers, people who have been directly impacted by the 94 crime bill today. And so just want to thank y'all for being open to sharing your story and really grounding us in what your vision is, and what the path forward looks like for us. And so I just want to, before we kind of get into the questions, want to start with asking our amazing panelists to really, if you could introduce yourselves. And right before I get into that, I do want to encourage folks to share your stories again, if you feel comfortable, via Twitter, social media, or you can put it in the chat box. And hashtag our safety, our freedom, as we continue to surface the impact of the 94 crime bill on ourselves and our communities. And so first I want to pass it to Nakia Manning from Black Organizing Project. If you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you do. And so I'll pass it to you, Nakia.
First off, I just want to say thank you all so much for creating this very necessary space to have this discussion around the impacts of policing on our communities at large. My name again is Nakia Manning. I am a proud member as well as a coordinator with the Black Organizing Project based here in Oakland, California. We were actually established back in 2009. And we are an all Black grassroots organization, member-led, multi-generational, in general, working for the racial, social, and economic justice of our folks, you know, here in the Bay Area. And so it was actually in 2011, we started our one and only campaign known as BOSS, our BOSS campaign, which stands for Better in Our School System. And just a little context about that campaign. We started that after we got word of the murder of a young Black male. His name was Raheem Brown Jr. After he was shot multiple times and murdered at the hands of the Oakland School Police Department outside of a high school. And so for our membership at that time, we were stunned. We questioned, you know, who knew that Oakland Unified School District, also known as OUSD, had its own internal school police department, right? As we began to do more research around what that really meant, we learned that not only did they invest in and employ their own internal school police department who are armed, or who were armed school police officers, but they were also contracted with OPD, Oakland Police Department, actually, and that was possible through the COPS Grant Act, that, you know, they were given funds to really, you know, partner with external police services. And then we also found out that there was actually a third level of law enforcement that was interacting with Black students, all students, and families, and that was the school security officers who were governed under the chief of school police. And so since 2011, in Raheem Brown's murder, we knew that we would dedicate ourselves to the fight of initially chipping away at what we know to be the Oakland School Police Department, but our vision was always that by 2020, abolition will be our reality. And so, just for the sake of time, just to recap, it was actually in June of this year, June 24th, 2020, where we were able to pass our George Floyd resolution that called for the immediate removal of the Oakland School Police Department, as well as barring any other law enforcement, partnership. And we won that within the district with a unanimous vote. And so this has been a nearly 10-year campaign that we knew would be possible. And it was no easy feat. And we owe it all to our membership, our community allies and supporters, and those who showed up in real radical solidarity, to make that happen and really set precedents for, what could be possible for across the rest of the nation. And so as I wrap up, just really quick where we are and where there is still more work needed, because as we know, that's just one phase of it, but implementation and making Black sanctuary a reality in Oakland and beyond is now the real work, right? So we are now in our implementation phase where we are working with community and calling on community near and far, because this will not be possible. Again, this next phase won't be possible, to continue to stand with us and continue to push for Black sanctuary and transform this district as we know it, from a police-centered school to a police-free school, and making sure that no student in Oakland and beyond will have to attend a school, with the fear of police presence. And so, to stay connected with us, you all can follow us on Black Organizing Project, at Black Organizing Project on Instagram, on Facebook, Black Org Project on Twitter. But I would love to spend more time with y'all and share the ways in which you can get engaged to continue this history, this legacy. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nakia. And before we kind of get into other parts of the story circle and other parts of the conversation, just want to pass it to you, Leslie, if you could just, introduce yourself, tell us a bit about your name, pronouns, your name, where you are from, the organization you're repping, and really like what is most important to you.
Sure. Thank you for having me. My name is Leslie Credle. My pronouns are she, her. I'm here representing the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. Our founder, Andrea James, could not be here tonight. But our organization was founded inside a federal prison in Danbury. And once it was created, our mission is to end the incarceration of women and girls. And for me, what is most important for me, the 94 crime bill was the catalyst, right, that began mass incarceration. It created the wave that turned into a tsunami. That engulfed our neighborhoods, separated families, traumatized our communities. And today, that water continues to rise, right? So what is most important to me right now is saving our people, saving our communities.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much for that, Leslie. And again, love to y'all for like the work you were doing. And so next I want to pass it to Trey. who is formerly with the New Florida Majority, but now with Fed Found for Life. So I'll pass it to you, Trey, to answer the same question: your name, pronouns, where you're from, and what organization you're repping, and like what's most important to you in this moment.
How y'all doing tonight? My name is Trey Johns. My pronouns are he, she, him, or her, whatever you comfortable with. I'm the executive director and co-founder of Fed Fam for Life. I'm born and raised in Chicago. I'm down here in South Florida. And what's important to me is the freedom of my sisters. I'm an abolitionist, and I want all my sisters out of prison, period.
Right, free them all. Thank you for that. So next, y'all, we kind of want to get into the questions. And again, thank you again for sharing this space with us. And so for our first question, would you, share your experience with policing, criminalization, and or incarceration, right? Because we know the 94 crime bill has impacted so many pieces of our lives and separated so many members of our families and communities. And so if it's cool, I'll start with you, Leslie, if you could just talk a bit about, share your experience with criminalization, policing, and or incarceration.
Sure. I was recently released from federal prison just over a year ago, right? My experience with policing, criminalization, and incarceration started in our communities, right? When we were children, right? Our Black young men, as soon as they reach man size, like teenagers, 15, 16, their bodies are grown, right? But their minds aren't. So as soon as they reach that man size, they're walking home from school, maybe a group of 5, because they live in the same neighborhood. They're targeted, right? They're targeted by police. They're thrown on police cars. They're thrown against the wall. And they're searched, and then they're labeled. They're put into a system, right, which they call a gang database. Let's just call it that. That starts a domino effect. Once that happens, they have a target on their back. They're targeted by police over and over because of that system. This is the path to incarceration. What happens is, our children who are not fully developed yet, at that age, you keep telling a kid that they're bad, that they're a gang member or they're a drug dealer because they live in a neighborhood where drugs are sold, or, they start to believe it. They start to take on this image. The police have created this narrative in our communities, right? That's what our community is about. They have set us up. They have embellished. They have exaggerated for the media. They obtain a ridiculous amount of funding and money and budgets so they can cycle our children in and out of prisons. This is modern day slavery. That's just what it is. They make 90 grand per person a year to incarcerate us. It's big business, and they don't want to let it go. So our community needs to wake up. We can end this. We can end this by putting our own people into office, right? Putting our people up there in power, in charge, so we can challenge these policies, change these policies. Nobody's going to save us but us. Only then we can begin to take the oversight over from the police, right? Start to defund them, start to put service back into our communities, give our neighborhoods the resources that they need. We need to heal and we need to grow. Only then we can show what different looks like.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that question, Leslie, and for like lifting it up. Because, you know, as you talk about young people, you know, we know that the 94 crime bill made it possible for 13-year-olds to be tried as adults. And so I saw Nakia talk in the chat, like, yes, young people are impacted by the school to prison pipeline, and some of that we can trace back to the 94 crime bill. So I'll pass it to you, Nakia, to talk a bit about, if you could, you know, just share an experience that you've seen or had with incarceration, criminalization, you know, and surveillance and policing. Policing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Leslie, for sharing that and those words. I think we all know as Black people, as brown people, as people of color, but primarily as Black people, the very close experience, whether we have been directly, you know, if we had direct interactions with police, or if they were indirect, still the impact on, you know, the mental, the psyche, the warfare, you know, the attack against the Black body, and all of these systems rooted in anti-Blackness. A lot of our children, their first interactions are actually with police, right? There are a lot of members within our organization whose first, you know, arrest, or first, you know, detainment, or you know, just interaction happen in school. Some as young as, and we see this continuing to happen today, some as young as 5 years old, right? Mm-hmm. And Leslie, to the point you brought up earlier, you know, as Black people, we are not seen as human, and that's the initial problem, right? And the illness, and therefore we are not treated as human, right? And we are seen as suspects versus students, or babies, you know. And so even in our campaign, we were always very clear that the ultimate goal was to end what we know as the school to prison pipeline that we know feeds into the overall system of mass incarceration, and being able to constantly draw the parallels between the similarity that actually the police in our communities are no different. The police in our communities murdering us, you know, and leaving us there in cold blood are no different from the police that are deployed inside of our school sites. No matter how you want to redesign them or rename them or call them mentors, right? Or all these, however they are dressed, right? Always remembering to push back against the narrative that police equals safety for us. And so again, in our organization, that is a major part of the work, constantly challenging, you know, the narrative that is fact, and actually not only divesting, you know, in police, not only starting with the very necessary reforms in the beginning of whatever path that you're in, but always making sure that abolition is the goal, and making sure that you continue to create spaces for our people, the ones who are most impacted, who are actually the experts, right? We don't ever need to search outside of ourselves, because at the end of the day, it is our everyday experience. The genetic code, right? That always makes us the experts and positions us to be equipped. And so, yeah, continuing to push that the school to prison pipeline is a very real thing, and we have to be in our schools. We have to protect and fight for our babies, and create the spaces and the reality that we know can be true. And it's only going to be us to get it done, like you said, Leslie. So.
Yeah, thank you for naming that, Nakia. And like, we know that the 94 crime bill helped fuel the school to prison pipeline by like throwing money at local governments to increase police numbers. And so I want to pass it to you, Trey. You know, same question if you could talk a bit about experiences you've had in the communities you work with around policing and incarceration.
Well, just speaking to the 94 crime bill, and just to give you how it directly impacted my life, my sister, she was a substance abuser. When they introduced cocaine into the Black communities in the 80s and 90s, I grew up in Chicago in the late 80s, early 90s. So I was right there in the thick of the crack epidemic, and I watched people that I love, turn into somebody that I never wanted to see. But that didn't deter me, that fueled me. I joined the military. When I got out of the military, I went to college. But yet and still my neighborhood and the things that were going on in my neighborhood continued to follow me into college. And what I mean by that is my sister had 4 children. So I had to take custody of my sister's 4 children because she was on drugs. My younger brother was incarcerated. So I had to take his 3 children. So by the time I was 25 years old, I had 8 children under the age of 12. And so I was in college. I graduated from SIU with my bachelor's degree in pre-law, a 3.7 GPA. And 5 days later, I was sentenced to 13 years in federal prison for less than $500 worth of drugs. And it was a cycle, because when my back was against the wall and these kids needed some food and stuff, and I couldn't get help or resources, because the resources go into policing, incarceration, and even the aftercare resources, they don't go into prevention, especially not back then, And so for $500, I went to prison. I spent 9 years in federal prison. And it continued with the 94 crime bill, because when they tried to pass a law called Booker versus Washington, and it gave relief to people in federal prison around 2005, but they didn't make it retroactive. So I missed Booker by 46 days. 46 days was the difference between me spending 9 years in prison and me spending 4 years in prison. So it continued on. When I was released, I've been home 10 years now, going on 11 years. And what I did in prison, I was supposed to go to law school. So I became a jailhouse lawyer, and I became one of the best jailhouse lawyers you will ever find in your life. And I was in 5 different federal prisons, because they would literally kick me out of prison because I would sue the prison. And they don't want those type of problems, And so when I was released, I continued. My organization, Fed Fam for Life, basically we still do legal work. We are proud to say we was Tyneese Hall, jailhouse lawyer for 11 years. She got clemency from President Donald Trump. I wrote 3 of her clemency petitions. It wasn't a big organization. It wasn't even an organization with money. It was me in my car on my phone. But I can proudly say I was part of, getting the clemency. And now down here in South Florida, what we've been doing is working on incarceration of women. We passed the Dignity for Incarcerated Women Act in 2019. It was unanimously, it went through the House and the Senate. The House and the Senate of Florida. Then in 2020, we came back for our rebound, and we passed the Tammy Jackson Act, which bans solitary confinement for pregnant women in the state of Florida. And at the same time, when we were passing Dignity for Incarcerated Women in Florida, I was also passing Dignity for Incarcerated Women in Tennessee. They call me 2-state Trey, because I passed 2 bills in 2 states in 1 year, 16 trips to each capital. So I strongly believe in the law. I love the law, and I know the law is one of the ways we can fundamentally stem the tide of mass incarceration.
Right. You said so much there, Trey. Thank you. Thank you for sharing it. And we know, as, elected officials were making a commitment to invest in policing and incarceration and controlling our bodies. They were defunding social services, education. And so, I mean, you really surfaced that and lifted that up for us. And so, and want to like name, and you kind of started getting into it, Trey, but really want to see like what would have, you know, what would you have needed? What would your communities have needed while, you know, we are being criminalized and arrested and incarcerated? What are services and support that we know our communities and folks who are experiencing incarceration policing need? And so I'll pass it back to you, Trey, because you kind of already started talking about that. If that's cool.
Well, I always say for me, it didn't take a 13-year prison sentence to tell me not to sell drugs no more. You know, like I said, I was on my way to law school. I had my whole life ahead of me, and they could have given me probation. They could have said, we gonna lock you up, and I would have stopped. You know, it didn't take the extreme. And so I feel like now we need to continue offering diversion programs, you know, to keep our people out of the system in the beginning. You know, we need that, and that's what that looks like with us. We did the Black Mama bailout down here in South Florida. We bailed 5 Black women out of jail. And we didn't just bail them out of jail and send them home. We bailed them out and we gave them wraparound services. One sister we put up in an Airbnb for 3 months. And all of them, we went to court with. 2 of them, because they had court support and advocacy, they've had their charges dropped. One of them got $50 a fine and about 5 or 10 community service hours, you know, and the other one, cases are still going through the court. But what we need to do is learn how to support and advocate. So many people sign themselves into prison, you know, and they because they don't know, because they don't have the representation, the money, the knowledge. And some people just go to prison so they can get out of those wretched jails. So just education, teaching our people and giving our people different ideas. And because you can give a person all the jobs in the world, we have to understand what our people want and what they need and offer them different opportunities and choices to achieve the things that they want to achieve, that they will work hard for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you for that. So, you know, we talking about making sure we meet our people's needs. And so I want to pass it to Nakia, because I know you have to go in a bit. What are the things that our folks are needing, right? That as we are, instead of policing, instead of a jail cell, instead of a prison and cell, like, what do we need?
Well, you know what? I would actually always make sure and pass that question back to the communities that we are working with, right? And always remind ourselves that, again, to stay inward, to continue to invest in ourselves and our communities, again, in recognizing that we are the most impacted and therefore the experts. And we know what we need, right? We know what could work better for us. What has been identified in our community, you know, is instead of police, you know, in our schools, investments in teachers, counselors, mental health services, right? School librarians, foster youth case managers. In Oakland, actually, while the school police department was actually being like renegotiated, or even, you know, while budget cuts were happening, that $6.5 million in the school police department was not being touched. However, all of those other very necessary and required positions were all being cut, right? So it was very clear to us, you know, who the district valued, who they said they valued. You know, in OUSD, they like to claim themselves to be a sanctuary district, right? Where they pride themselves in protecting newcoming students, right, and families, as they should, protecting, you know, students and families from ICE. But what we recognized was Black students were not included in that sanctuary, right? So again, always relying on the internal community to decide and define who it is and what it is they see and feel safe by, and to begin to invest in those things in people versus police criminalization, and dehumanization.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And I know right before you leave, Nakia, if you could just talk a bit about what's your vision of freedom and how we get into that vision?
My personal vision of freedom, I believe Trey uplifted this in one way or another, but my personal vision of freedom will absolutely have to be the access to quality education, the access to self and community reflection, and the access to self-determination. Again, creating the space in reality where I have the agency to choose who I want to be, to live how I want to live, and making sure that I am never individually, going, but always, bringing my community with me and recognizing that I am actually no one without the community and the legacy, and the people and ancestors that I come from that have made my life what it is, and put me in position today to be a part of this work and continue the work and legacy that they started. So that is my vision of freedom, ultimately.
Got you. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you, and just gratitude to you for all the work you were doing. And so next, I just want to pass it to you, Leslie. Similar question. What would you have needed, right, instead of criminalization and incarceration, policing? Pass it to you.
Yeah, I agree with my sister Nakia over there. We have to take responsibilities for each of our own communities, right, where we live at. Only we know what our communities need. So us formerly incarcerated people, when I came home, I saw there was a movement going on. Andrea James, she has inspired leaders all over this country, right? So we have to create more leaders. She's inspired me to be a leader. We have to step up, us formerly incarcerated people, to take on the issues, because we know what the issues are, right? And keep it personal, issues that you feel strongly about, right? So something that you can attack and let somebody else attack something else. For me, it was housing. When I was in the halfway house, I saw, a lot of women coming home and they were forced to be homeless, right? Which is ludicrous to me because they had homes to go to. But because they were on probation or parole, they couldn't go because their families were on housing assistance or Section 8 or something like that. So, and forcing them to be homeless. So right now, I created an organization, Justice for Housing. I'm working on a bill, like my sister Trey over here, fighting it, from a legal way to change those discriminatory housing policies, right? Which is another systematic strategy that they have put in place, probation and parole, forcing folks to be homeless upon reentry. It sets them up for failure, leads them to recidivate, right? Keep filling up our prisons, right? That is the goal. I have to lift up my sister, Stacy Borden in Massachusetts. She's created Kimya's House, right? It's a diversion program where instead of incarceration, women will get the substance abuse, the mental health, working on their domestic violence, right? And then I can feed them into that housing piece, right? So it all works together, right? She has her piece, I have my piece. Like Families for Justice Healing, another agency. I work closely with Melly Hadana. You know, we have our participatory defense department. Like Kia said, we have to educate, right? Keep our people out of prisons. Participatory defense puts that peace that keeps people out of jail. So, you know, for me, I'd say become a leader. Fight for what you believe in, right? In your community. And all of us all over the country doing this work, coming home, was inspiring for me, right? I came home angry, right? I came home mad. My daughter was killed while I was in prison, right? So I had a lot to be mad about, right? So this work has given me that purpose, right? I turn my pain into purpose. So I just say we keep lifting each other up. The National Council, they're about to launch a 413B where we can support formerly incarcerated people who want to run for office or you know, get into government. Not even formerly incarcerated people, just our people that look like us, right? So that's a power move. We put our people in those places. Only then we could create all that change, right? Because it starts there. And until we control there, we're gonna keep fighting, you know? So we have to start right there. And then everything would just fall into place.
Thank you for naming that. You said, both of y'all, and Nikki also said so much, like we need housing, we need supportive services, we need real quality education, and we need support and care and community. And so next, y'all, I just want to, like, you know, in our final moments, want to ask you, Trey, just like, what is your vision for freedom, and what does the work look like? How are you getting there?
Well, one thing, you know, we glossed over is, you know, we sometimes fail to recognize the trauma and mental health coming from incarceration, the trauma and mental health of leaving your children, the trauma of praying somebody don't hurt your children, take advantage of your children. And you go through that every day. And that's why, you know, when women come home, or when women come home from incarceration, they need real support. You know, we have healing spaces. You know, we have circles. You know, we work with an organization called Triumphant Together, an amazing trans organization that heals, you know, from inside, because we need that spiritual empowerment. Or, you know, like my sisters like Topeka Sam with the Ladies of Hope Ministry, the Hope House in New York. You know, they offer entrepreneurship. You know, we can't continue, oh, you got out of jail, go get you a job at McDonald's. Our sisters deserve better. So they offer entrepreneurship, advocacy, housing, education, you know what I'm saying? A lot, empowerment. You know, that's one of the main things that women need coming home, is to know that they're still as good as they was when they went in. You know, so for me, a vision of freedom is real support. I'm an abolitionist. We can do away with prison because the prison system as it is today is trash. You know, there's no reforming, there's no fixing. We need to get rid of it and start over. There is things that we can do without putting people in cages for 25 and 30 years and then letting them go. We still got people suffering from the 90 crime war, drug war that has been incarcerated since 94 or 99 and things like that. You know, all of that is not necessary. So in a vision of freedom, we have a different way to treat our people. And with me especially, we have a different way to treat incarcerated women. 90, not 90, but probably about 80% of incarcerated women are in there for crimes of survival. You very rarely have women starting international drug cartel rings. You very rarely have women doing major crimes, but we get major time. And women don't even get equity and compassion. And I say that because during the White House Clemency Project of 2016, 30,000 clemency applications went into the White House and only 1,700 was approved. And only out of those 1,700, there was 109 women. We can't even get equality and compassion. They have COVID-19 responses, compassionate releases. I've had more men receive compassionate releases than mothers saying they got small children at home. They got a little bit of time left. They are still being compassionate to men more so than they are incarcerated women. So when we talk about fairness and equity and equality, I err on the side of supporting my sisters because we get a bad deal.
Yeah, thank you, Trey. Thank you for just really laying that out for us, what freedom, what justice looks like. And so I'll pass it to you, Leslie. What's your vision of freedom and what's the path forward look like for you?
I agree with my sister Trey, right? Prisons cause harm, right? I suffered. I was traumatized losing my child in jail. We can do better, right? We can change the system. I say shut it down, right? Shut it the fuck down, close it. Like we are abolitionists, right? We have to take control of our own fate. Step up, do something about it. Trey, heads up to you, reaching back, filing for your sister's clemency. I did the same thing. I just filed for my Bunky's clemency like a month ago, right? I haven't forgot my sisters who I left inside. I speak to them all the time. And I tell them, I'm gonna bring you home. So I say to anybody, do whatever you can in your community. If it's participatory defense, if it's clemency, if it's working on closing prisons, whatever it is that you feel passionate about that has to do something with ending incarceration of women, I say do all you can and do your best. Step up and do something about it. Only then will we be free.
That's real. Thank y'all. I mean, really, we know, think that what the vision looks like going forward. And so, we're thinking about real support and compassion for our people instead of locking them up, instead of putting us in cages, instead of policing us. We know that, the vision is abolition, right? Abolition of the prison industrial complex and a different way to treat our people, which involves real supportive services. And y'all also named throwing down around abolition and ending incarceration, ending policing, join an organization. So National Council, you can join FedFam for Life. You can shout out to Black Organizing Project, and also hit us up at the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom. So because there's so many worthy organizations who are doing this real work to make sure our people are out of cages and at home with their families and communities. And so, just love and gratitude to you, Trey and Leslie and Nakia, for y'all sharing your stories and really grounding us in the impact of the 94 crime bill and what a vision for freedom can look like and how we throw down around real abolition and get our people free. And so if y'all have anything else to say before I pass it to Marv, I just want to pass it to y'all one last time.
I got one thing to say. If you haven't registered for the Free Her conference tomorrow, go to the nationalcouncil.us and register. It starts tomorrow, and you want to be there.
Thank you for that, Leslie. Trey.
Just real quick, you know, we always looking for volunteer law students. We got law students up at CUNY Law in New York, and they be throwing down, getting people out of prison. You know, we don't pay no money, but
Right.
good put on your resume.
Yeah. So we down to work with y'all and just love and solidarity to y'all. So gratitude, and I'll pass it to you, Marbre, to ground us in the history of slavery and incarceration. Thank y'all again.
Thank y'all so much. I feel renewed in so many ways. So I want to just thank you, Leslie and Trey and Nakia, for just the gems. I feel like you dropped some more blessings on us, this idea of pain without purpose. And so I want to thank you for your work and for sharing today. So my name is Marbre. I use she and her pronouns. I'm with Law for Black Lives. And I'm super, super excited to spend the next 10 or so minutes trying to ground this conversation also in a long history and legacy of racism, of misogyny, of anti-Blackness, of anti-Brownness, that our criminal legal system really comes out of and grows from. And I think there's kind of 3 key reasons. I don't know if there's a slideshow that I'm missing. Let's see. Is it up? Beautiful. Thank you, Jen. Shout out to Jen, who's doing all logistics. So I think I want to really ground us in kind of the history of mass incarceration period, and policing for kind of 3 key reasons. I think that it's really essential that we know where we are going. We have to know where we've come from. And the origins of this system, the soil in which it is planted, have drastic impacts on how it operates every single day and on who it operates, right? And so it's important that we know our history so that we also know our future. Oh, next slide. And my hope and my goals in the next 10 minutes is to do 4 kind of key things. I'm going to do them all real quick, so we're going to just kind of give a taste of things. It's a tasting show. Number 1 is to denaturalize policing and incarceration. Very often there's this idea that these are natural phenomenons. They are not. We can destroy them. We can get rid of them. We have that power. So that's the first thing, is just to make it really clear this is not natural, it's not God's will, that we can fight back against it. Number 2 is to really explore the origins of policing and to root that concretely in slavery and in the colonial mission to expand and steal Native American and indigenous land. And so be really clear about that too, that this is a long, long history of theft, of genocide, and of anti-Blackness that really is the roots of this current system. And then number 3 is to contextualize the passage of the 94 Crime Bill inside of a bunch of other anti-Black, anti-immigrant, anti-women legislation. This is a moment in US history that's a manifestation of the kind of backlash to the Black Power movement and liberation movement. And that we should understand that as that, and really make our fight as expansive as the attack was. And then lastly, just begin to flex our imagination on what is possible. If we break down these systems, as folks on the last panel talked about, if we follow the leadership of Trey and of Leslie and tear it all down, what can we build instead? So I want to really start us off, so next slide, with kind of what do y'all know? And so I know that Zoom is a limited space to be interactive, but this call, not only this panel, but also the whole call, is full of incredible knowledge, both expertise and knowledge. And I want us to have a collective space to share that. And so I want to encourage folks through this whole conversation. I see you on the chat box. That's beautiful and dope. Keep on doing that. If you have resources, things you've read, things you've heard, things you know that you want to share, I want to encourage you to share that with the group. And I will try to read from it. I'm not the best multitasker, so you might have to scroll through the chat yourself, but I will try and highlight kind of what I see as well. But it's really important. All of us bring our own experiences and our own expertise to this. And so I want to encourage you to supplement what I'm saying with what you know to be true. So the first question I want to just throw out there for folks to respond to in the chat box is, have you read The New Jim Crow or seen The 13th? And these are 2 books, one's a book, one's a movie, about kind of mass incarceration in the criminal legal system. And if so, what did you know about policing before and what do you know now? And so just any thoughts about how those books or other things you've read or seen have influenced how you understand policing and incarceration in this country. Would love for you to share that with folks. And again, throughout the next 10 or so minutes, would love you to share whatever's popping up and bubbling up for you. It's really important that we're in this conversation together. So next slide. There we go. So the first thing I want to just say is that policing is not a natural phenomenon. And the reason why that's so essential to say is because I think when we think things are natural phenomena, when we think they've always been there, that they are inevitable, or they are natural in some ways, it's really hard to imagine a world without them. And I think this is not an accident. Just like capitalism, there's a lot of forces in the world, whether it's elected officials or police unions, who go out of their way to really make sure that we think that these are natural phenomena that cannot be changed. And so when you think something's natural, you never imagine a future without it. And so I think it's really important for our work and for the fights that we have to just name that these are not natural and they have not always been here. We have not always had police. There are still neighborhoods on the Upper West Side here in New York and the Hamptons that don't have police, right? That is not a natural phenomenon to have police on our corners, to have people surveilling us, to have cages that they put people inside of. These are not natural, these are not okay phenomenons, and we can build a world without them. Next slide. Beautiful. And I think someone already put this, Sherry, thank you so much. But just around kind of what are the origins of policing. So we'd love for folks, if you're down, to share, what do you think are the origins, the beginnings of policing and incarceration in this country? And so whatever comes up for you, would love for you to add that to our collective knowledge. Next slide. But for me, I think there's three things that we can really name as the beginnings of policing. And the first two on this slide, which are slave patrols and colonial origins, are kind of prototypes. And when I say prototypes, I mean that is the model on which all that follows was built. And so the prototype of slave patrols is the model on which modern policing was built, as well as colonial origins. And there's actually a really powerful photo here that we have of a slave patrol in the top left-hand corner, and then right under it is a stop and frisk from 10 years ago. And so we see this through line that continues through today's policing and practices and in purpose that starts with these prototypes. Next slide. So the first one, oh no, that's not supposed to be the next slide. So I'm going to just talk through this. So the first one is really slave patrols. And slave patrols were really just groups of white folks with guns who used to patrol around plantations. They would make sure, or try to make sure, that black folks who were minding their own business, walking around, were not quote unquote slaves. They also would chase down folks who went to seek their own freedom and tried to escape. They also punished enslaved workers for breaking the quote-unquote rules of the plantation. And many times they would just stop black folks, free or not, and harass them. And so in many ways, this is very, very similar to stop and frisk that we see here in New York, where I'm based, and across the country. And so slave patrols are really the beginning, the seeds of our policing. The other kind of origins of policing is actually in white militias that were in the kind of Western and Midwestern states after the expansion, and by expansion, I mean theft of indigenous land. And so after Andrew Jackson sent a bunch of folks out to steal Indian land and indigenous land, they formed colonial kind of patrols that were charged with essentially enforcing the genocidal mission of colonialization. And so we see these kind of two origins. One is in suppressing and dispossessing indigenous people of their land, and the other one is in controlling black folks' bodies in order to make sure that white folks could profit. And so these are really the two origins of policing in the South, the Midwest, and the West. In the North, we see the beginnings of policing really in larger cities that were undergoing industrial revolutions. And the first police forces were actually created to put down union strikes. And so in the middle of kind of the beginning of industrialization, we see a lot of unionization happening. We see things pushing against child labor, against 15-hour days, against weekly wages, against minimum wages, all of these things. And in response to that, the corporations teamed up with local city governments and created police forces to actually violently suppress unionization. And so we understand the beginnings of policing are in these kind of very corrupt, oppressive goals, which is one, to control black bodies, two, to steal indigenous land, and three, to suppress unionization, right? So those are really the beginnings of policing in this country. And so it's no wonder that we see the police continue to behave in the ways that they behave, because this is really from where they come, right? And the other thing we want to talk about today a little bit is the kind of beginnings and the origins of incarceration. And so we'd love for folks to share what they think those are. From, I think, our assessment, there are kind of four major moments that lead to peaks in incarceration. One is the 13th Amendment. Another one is Black codes and convict leasing. And then lastly, and this was touched on by Trey and others, is the war on drugs. Next slide. So the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment, of course, is one of the amendments that was passed after the Civil War, so after we took up arms for our freedom, that was meant to ensure our liberation, right? That was really the goal. The 13th Amendment, however, has a huge loophole, and we have the text of the amendment on the slide. So it says that slavery and involuntary servitude are banned, but it says except as punishment for crime. So just like a moment with that. So no slavery except for, right? So there's this but that is put in the middle of the 13th Amendment that has been used and abused extensively. And so we see immediately following the end of slavery, next slide, we see the onset of both Black codes and convict leasing. And so Black codes are laws that were passed throughout the country that limited the movement, the expression, and the freedom of Black folks, and really were meant to ensure that they stayed in oppressive relationships with their formal so-called owners. And so we see these pop up across the country. There were Black codes in Mississippi that forced folks to sign a contract every January for the next year's labor, which essentially put folks inside a convict, inside of really oppressive labor relationships and bad contracts with literally the folks who said they owned them years before because of slavery. We also saw Black codes in Louisiana that made it illegal for any Black person to drink. Literally, if you drank in public, you could be arrested and put in jail. We also saw Black codes in Maryland that allowed for courts to take the children of quote unquote unfit Black people and put them into unpaid quote unquote apprenticeship, which really was just another form of slavery. And so we saw the increase of kind of the use of child labor, of slave labor, because they were being stolen from Black families who were seen as quote unquote unfit. And we see the parallel of this all over in our kind of court and child welfare state, which is constantly stealing our children and separating our families. There also were Black codes across the country that made the gathering of Black people in public illegal, made curfew so that Black folks couldn't be out past 8 or 10 o'clock at night. And so we see these laws that really were just meant to create reasons to criminalize Black people, whether it's their bodies, whether it's their movement, whether it's their labor. And we're meant to put Black folks back into relationship with white folks that would exploit them and oppress them. And so the Black codes were used to charge Black folks with a wide array of different offenses. And then convict leasing was used to force them into labor. And so once folks were arrested and convicted of these completely made up and false crimes, they were then forced to go back to many times the same plantations that they worked as free labor to work as prisoners. And so the state would lease, thus convict leasing, would lease Black folks back to plantation owners to work for free for the time of the sentence. And literally hundreds of thousands of Black folks were forced back into slavery essentially by convict leasing and Black codes. And again, we can see some real parallels between the Black codes of the 1800s and 1900s and the kind of 20th century war on drugs, right? And so we know that there are loitering offenses, that if you are inside of parks because you are houseless, that is now against the law. There are noise ordinances that if you play music too loud, even on your own porch, they can arrest you. There are laws in Florida that if you have baggy pants in a courtroom, they can arrest you. And so we see kind of this creation of laws to criminalize Black bodies and Black people in order to then send them to jail and get around slavery using this loophole in the 13th Amendment. Beautiful. Next slide. So the other kind of major moment where we see a huge spike in incarceration, especially of Black folks, is the war on drugs. I think that folks know a lot about this. It was discussed on the panel. It's the reason why lots of our people who we love are locked up today. And the war on drugs was the onslaught of new laws and funding streams. So it was the creation of laws, of harsher punishments, but it also pushed a bunch of money to states to incarcerate and lock folks up through bills like the 94 crime bill that was launched in the aftermath of the war on drugs. And so I'm going to try and go quickly because we only have about 5 more minutes, but really the war on drugs was a left and a right, a Republican and a Democratic invention, and was executed by both of those parties as well. And so we see the kind of the beginnings of the war on drugs, again, in the liberation movement of the Black Power movement, the Civil Rights movement, and the Indigenous People liberation movement. There was a huge backlash throughout the country by mostly white elected officials, what Nixon said that was a silent majority, to the vocalization and the demands of the Black liberation movement. And so as early as 1950s and 60s, we see Southern and Northern and Western across the country policymakers talking about law and order. Again, we hear that in kind of the Trump campaign. And that was meant to really figure out how to criminalize protests, criminalize Black folks, criminalize the revolution that was happening across the country. And the first kind of national figure to really push this was Richard Nixon in his 1968 and then 72 election. And we know now, because one of Richard Nixon's closest kind of allies, his domestic policy advisor, made very clear to us that this was a political fight. This wasn't ethical. It wasn't actually about feel. It was deeply political. And so we were told by his domestic policy advisor that the Nixon campaign in 68 had two enemies. One was the anti-war left and Black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be Black or to be against the war. And so instead, we got the public to associate hippies with marijuana and Black folks with heroin, and then criminalize both heavily to disrupt those communities. And so this is the roadmap of the war on drugs, that you associate Black folks with a certain kind of drug, then you criminalize that drug, and you destroy the fabric of their communities by doing that. And again, this was done not just by Nixon, but then after Nixon by Reagan, after Reagan by Clinton, and then by Bush. Next slide. And so again, these are some of the presidents, although we continue to see, I think, parts of the war on drugs under Obama as well, who really continued and executed this war against Black and brown people, and used drugs as the most recent excuse to criminalize Black bodies, to control Black labor, and to really disrupt Black families. Next one. So as a result of this history first of slavery, of indigenous genocide, of the destruction of unions, and then the war on drugs, we really can understand why incarceration in the US is both incredibly racialized, that it's overwhelmingly Black and brown people who are locked inside of cages, who are criminalized, but also that it's incredibly expensive. And so you see two charts here. One is the US population by race, and the other one is incarceration by race. And so although there are way more white folks in the US, you see that in fact there are more Black and Latinx folks who are actually locked up in this country. The second chart is how much money is spent, which is really literally trillions of dollars that is used to incarcerate, to cage, and to police, and now to surveil Black and brown neighborhoods. I think it's important to name that this money comes at the cost of investments that Erica and others talked about in our communities. And so there's been, I think, a systemic abandonment of Black and brown communities when it comes to the social safety net, but there's been huge investments in their incarceration and in our caging. Next slide. So really quickly, the 94 Crime Bill was not the only act or the only bill passed in the 90s that criminalized Black bodies, that took away our children, that sought to criminalize us. There was a whole host of anti-poor, anti-Black, and anti-immigrant legislation passed under Clinton with a Democratic Senate and Congress in the 1990s, and was really a manifestation of what was decades in the making in terms of the war on drugs. And so we saw the 94 Crime Bill, which Dave talked a bit about. We also saw the Immigration Reform Bill. This was a bill that really laid the groundwork for mass deportations that we saw through Obama and now through Trump, and also created penalties for immigrants accused of any crime, even super minor crimes, and created more crimes. This was a decade of crime creation, right? Everything was a crime. Also, the 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act was not what it actually says. It was the Welfare Destruction Act. It destroyed the cash welfare system in the United States, and also included a lifetime ban on all benefits, including food stamps, for anybody who was convicted of a drug offense. Just again, a lifetime ban on food stamps even for folks who use drugs. So we see the dehumanization of our people in each of these different acts. The next one was the Anti-Terrorism and Death Penalty Act, which essentially shut down the very few avenues that existed that folks like Trey used to get folks out. And so it limited habeas petitions. It really allowed folks who were locked up to have no way out of those cages. And then lastly, the Safe Adoption and Families Act, which was an act that has led to literally the taking away and the theft of tens of thousands, if not millions, of children. And so it has a provision where automatically, if you are in jail for more than 15 months or in prison, you lose permanent custody of your children. And so all of these together really created a landscape that criminalized Black and brown folks, and that led to this moment that we are in now. We're trying to kind of dismantle the whole thing. Next slide. And I'll end here. I think we tell this history to make clear that this is not a system that is broken. This is a system that is working exactly how it was meant to work and how it was supposed to work. And that in order to change it, we have to transform it. We have to uproot all that is there and recreate it. We have to stretch our imaginations and imagine something different and denaturalize cages, denaturalize policing, and think of new ways that we can support our communities when harm happens and provide for our communities when it doesn't. So I'm going to stop there and pass it on. But thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and I hope this grounding was helpful.
Hi, my name is Cedric Lawson. I am with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and I'm happy to move into the next slide that will be after that one. So moving into action steps. So I'll be very brief considering time. So what can you do to take action? You can take action by engaging your House members and senators to demand Congress no longer send federal dollars to local police departments by demanding an end to these federal programs that we've described. You can sign petitions and otherwise demand letters and identify and support candidates that have committed to curtailing federal spending on police. We're at this really amazing moment, as most of you know, related to the upswell of activism that we've seen this year and this past summer after the murder of George Floyd and also Breonna Taylor, amongst countless other individuals. So with that said, we're at this moment where we can take full advantage to the best of our ability to hold our decision makers accountable, particularly as we move into this election, as we work to dismantle these unjust systems. And I want to move into the next slide. So in terms of the BREATHE Act, this is a bill that has been formulated by a number of different community leaders and also championed by Ayanna Presley out of Massachusetts. It is a bill that moves a little bit further than what we saw after Congress worked to address what had happened in Minneapolis. Many of you may have heard of the Justice and Policing Act, which did pass in the House, but sadly what we saw in the Senate was the Justice Act, which would have given more dollars in federal policing with a Democratic House and a Republican Senate, just in terms of two different parties. We haven't seen any type of bill come from the Justice and Policing Act, which would have, among many things, ended racial profiling, versus this bill in the Senate, which would have given more dollars. What we see also at this point is the potential of legislation like the BREATHE Act, which is more forward-looking. And we see with the BREATHE Act divest from federal resources from incarceration and policing, invest in new non-punitive, non-carceral approaches to community safety, then also allocation of new monies to build healthy, sustainable, and equitable communities, and also hold political leaders to their promises and enhance self-determination of all communities. So at this point, this is a great example of a potential bill. It has not yet been introduced, but again, an example where community leaders have come together and have worked with Congress to not just either tie dollars to accountability measures for law enforcement, or even worse than that, put dollars forth to policing, but instead reimagine new potential. So while again, this bill has not yet been introduced, this is a potential in ways that we can reimagine what public safety looks like. So to close, again, encouraging you all to reach out to your legislators in regards to these issues, but from that point, also keeping in mind the upcoming election and what it means to reimagine how we can stop these atrocities.
Cool. Thank you, Cedric. Peace, everybody. My name is Kamau. I use he, him pronouns. I'm based in Flatbush, Brooklyn, and I am the National Coordinator for People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom So the slide that everybody has in front of them right now is a breakdown of the objectives of the People's Process, which is part of, I think, what makes our coalition really special when we talk about the imagination that we have collectively to build a different world. And so our coalition's work is rooted in that, and we're leading a national effort to make that happen. So the objectives of the People's Process are listed on this slide. We want to catalyze national intention to repeal and replace the 1994 crime bill with proposals that come out of the process that we're running. And those processes will center the stories and expertise of the communities and individuals most impacted, as we've touched on tonight. We want to support local power and capacity, expanding that work around the country, engaging in mass political abolition-centered education so that folks can deepen, develop, and even transform their understanding of the PIC, the prison industrial complex. Like Marbury and others have mentioned before, it seems really clear to me and a lot of folks in this work that abolition sometimes feels unimaginable by design. And some of the work that we're doing is trying to reimagine, create new realities for ourselves and for each other. Doing that through participatory democratic processes and developing language that prioritizes like what our communities need to be safe, to be healthy, and to thrive. So can we go to the next slide? Thanks, Jen. So join us, get plugged in. We're gonna be doing a lot of work over the end of this year and going into 2021. If your organization or just you as a person is interested in engaging in criminal legal system transformation work, interested in learning more about abolition, interested in learning more about reimagining safety as a collective, then we would love for you to join us. So please follow us on Instagram, on Twitter. You can see the handles there. We also have a website that I will drop into the chat, and you'll get a lot more information from us in the follow-up emails and things like that after tonight. And finally, we just want folks to fill out the link that I will drop in the chat as well to express your interest in the People's Process that we're going to be running throughout the rest of this year and into 2021. And I also just want to lift up really quickly as well that just remind folks that, as Claudia mentioned like way earlier in the evening, that we're going to also be sharing the graphic notes on our socials, in addition to sending them out to folks that have registered for this event, so you can kind of see, you know, what came from this conversation that is really grounded, in addition to being, I think, really expansive and imaginative. So we're really grateful for that. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I want to express my deepest gratitude to our panelists for their wisdom and for being with us for all this time. We really appreciate you all, and we'll be in touch about the next steps and about the next teach-in really soon. So take care, everybody.